Hello everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. It's lovely to see so many people here on such a dark, miserable, horrible night. We're really grateful that you've all come, so thank you. Welcome to Book Talk. Here for the first time in the august surroundings of Cardiff University's Special Collections and Archives. We will be filming tonight's event. I'm not sure if Sarah just mentioned that. The camera's pointing at us, so none of you will appear on the film in any way, and I'll probably be taking a few photos later for our Instagram, and I'll try not to get any of you. So just be aware that we are filming this, and it will appear on our YouTube channel later, where I might add, there is a growing archive of fascinating materials for you all to enjoy. There will be time at the end of tonight's event for you to ask questions of the authors. There's no need to stick to our topic tonight for that. Please ask them anything that you would like, but just get your little grey cells working as they talk, thinking what you might like to ask them. Our event tonight is called Writing the City. We ask how novelists capture the essence of city life. Arenas of conflict, desire and revelation. Cities are a jumble of the old and the new, the strange and the familiar. Places where we carve out our lives, find work and search for community. What is it that makes a city feel real on the page? Is it a question of research or an act of imagination? Do we start with witnesses or with archives? And what cities are revealed through a character's story? And with these questions in mind, I'd like to introduce our two authors tonight. Both of their novels, they're both debut novelists, and both books depend for their effect on deftly and the precision with which they write about place, with which they evoke the places they write about. Rachel Dawson comes from Swansea and lives in Cardiff. Rachel's debut novel, Neon Roses, is a queer coming-of-age story set against the backdrop of 80s Britain in the era of the miners' strike and Section 28. As a child of the 80s myself, I think she captures something, really captures something about that period. It's amazing work, and if you haven't already read it, I do hope you will be inspired to read it tonight. Emma Harding grew up in Birmingham and currently works in Cardiff for the BBC, where she writes and directs radio drama, specialising in adaptations of classic plays and novels. Emma's novel, The Berliners, is about the interweaving histories of the inhabitants of an apartment building in Berlin, from the early 1900s to the present day. And I love the way that Emma pulled off the trick of writing something that is both a gripping and propulsive novel, and in many ways also a collection of very different and engaging short stories. Without any further ado, we'll hand you over to Emma and Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming tonight. It's very nice to see you all on this rainy, drear night. Rachel, should we start by just giving a little bit of a sense of the plot of each of our novels? I'm going to be mean and make you start first.
Yeah, I think Colin summarised it really well. It's a lesbian coming-of-age novel set at the beginning of the miners' strike up until the implementation of Section 28. And the main character, Enid, she starts off living at home with her parents and her sister, who has quite different political views from the rest of the family. She's younger than Enid and more academic, and is set on following a career in the law, and is having some sort of Thatcherite views. And Enid is very much quite similar to her parents. She's the eldest child, a little bit sort of spoiled. She's very creative, makes her own clothes, and it sort of follows the journey of her growing up, leaving home, and what she does next.
Great. And The Berliners is set in a single apartment block on the second floor of Friedrichstrasse, number 19, in the middle of Berlin, but at 6 different periods in time. So all my characters live in the same apartment, but at different times. So we start in 1906, there's a story from 1929, 1948, the 1960s, the 1980s, and a 2018 section. And all the stories sort of speak to each other and haunt each other in different ways, and we keep moving between all 6 strands. If you know anything about Berlin, you'll know about Checkpoint Charlie. So Friedrichstrasse runs north to south through the centre of the city, and it's where Checkpoint Charlie was during the Cold War. So the street itself was bisected by the Berlin Wall, and my house was in the west of Berlin. It doesn't really exist. There's a gap in the houses at number 19, but I kind of modelled it on the building next door, which does still exist and which miraculously survived the devastation of World War II, because most of Friedrichstrasse was obliterated. So yes, I think that's my summary. Rachel, I guess we both set out to write about periods of history that we weren't around for, personally. Did you have any, what drew you to this era, first of all? What drew you to the 1980s?
I think, so I was born in 1989, and I think for me my interest in the 1980s started when I was like, sort of 6, 7, when my mum used to let me wear her old cocktail dresses and dresses that she used to go out to nightclubs in, with like the puffed sleeves and the mesh and the lame and the tulle and the velvet. And I used to love them. And I used to love 80s music. In high school, I was a bit of a goth. I used to love Kraftwerk and The Cure, and Bauhaus and those sorts of bands. So that was always my interest in the 80s. My parents are both really left-wing, and the history department in the school I went to was pretty left-wing as well. And we learnt a lot about, the Chartists and the Merthyr Rising and Paul Robeson and the Welsh response to the Spanish Civil War. But we never, and we've learnt about the miners' strike too, but we never covered the fundraising that was done by lesbians and gays to support the miners in the 80s. And it was actually seeing Pride was my first introduction to that, and I sort of couldn't believe that I missed that, because it's such an interesting point in time where you've got solidarity between 2 groups that you might not think naturally have solidarity with each other, and that really intrigued me. So I wanted to write something that was like fun and sexy, but also and sort of character driven, but also had a firm historical point of view and political point of view, because that's what I enjoy reading. I grew up reading loads of Sarah Waters, and I think that's what inspired me.
Should we hear a reading?
Yes, if that's all right. So this is when the aforementioned group, Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, come down to Elined's village, which is kind of loosely based on Ontloyn, sort of Ontloyn Banwan. It's a bit of a soup, but in that Dulais Valley. Elined watches the bubbles in her beer rise to the top. June frets at her fingernails, splitting the ends into flakes. What else do you do up London? June must have some stories. Gigs, clubs, that sort of thing. I'm an artist. Tremendous, I love art. Elined was hoping there would be someone like-minded. June widens her eyes. What sort of stuff do you do? Elined hasn't done anything proper with paints and cups of murky water since she was at school. All she ever does now is doodle models from the magazines to fill time when the shop is quiet. Clothes, people. Good for you, June says, resting her chin on her palm again. Her elbow splays out along the bar, dangerously close to someone else's pint. What about you? Elined asks. I print mainly, but I'll give anything a go. June thumbs at a small brooch on her lapel. I made this. The brooch is made of small red beads strung on wire, twisted into a lumpy shape, like a wishbone with a ball sack hanging inside of it. Elined can't work it out. She bends towards June, squints while she tries to work out what she's looking at. June smirks. It's a clit. That's what it looks like underneath. It's a scandal that women are taught that it's this tiny nub instead of this big, powerful thing. Big and powerful is hardly pissing Knight Rider. June throws back her head and laughs. Elined gets a better look at her teeth now. Her pointy canine juts proudly out from the gum and overlaps the next tooth along. Mabley squints over at them, nursing a second glass of wine. Elined hopes Mabley's getting a real eyeful of them chatting away. Drink it in. It's been so long since she's spoken to anyone other than her family, Maya and Lloyd. June is a cold lemon squash on a hot afternoon. Alina touches June's wrist. June flinches, and with her other hand she brushes down her sleeve until her fingers disappear into the leather bulk. Sorry, Alina says. It's nice to share a joke with a stranger. June takes a long chug of her pint and lights another fag, squashing her glass into the crystal ashtray between them. June has got to stay here at the bar with Alina. She has got to think of something good to make her stay. I've been collecting for the strike as well. I made £95. Good on you, Bab. The most money I ever made was shaking the buckets in the dark rooms. In photography students. Alina has seen pictures of photographers in dark rooms, floating film in trays of chemicals and hanging them on washing lines. June seems smart enough to do that. June swallows her cigarette smoke. She hacks violently, bent over the bar. Her fingers spasm, letting her cigarette fall, then bounce along the bar. Alina darts to rescue it. The committee will go apeshit if Alina lets June scorch a mark in the wood. No, June wheezes and takes a deep breath. A dark room, like in a gay bar. Thank you.
How did you go about thinking yourself into the 1980s? What was your kind of research process?
It was quite a detailed research process and quite research driven. I think the first bolts of inspiration came from, on my honeymoon, my wife and I went to New York and we spent quite a lot of time doing gay things. So we went to the Leslie Lohman Gallery and there were these beautiful, intimate, erotic photographs taken by Donna Gottschalk, which is a surname that crops up in your book.
Yeah.
I noticed that the other night. Of her and her lovers in this lovely wooden cabin that they had in the woods up in Maine. And I also went to the Lesbian History Archives in Brooklyn, which has got, like we were talking about earlier, as we started this, it's got loads of archives of sort of special interest groups and like student groups and hobby groups that would meet that all had sexuality in common. So yeah, that's when I sort of started to put building blocks down, and then I beefed it out. I went to the People's History Museum in Manchester, the Bishopsgate Archives in London, and there's a lot of great material online that's free to access. The Manchester Dance Music Archive, or MDMA, is particularly useful. There's a lot of scans from old magazines, including, you know, like when you go to a gay bar and you've got those magazines that they have in the vestibule that are sort of like, what's on tonight? They've got those with like listings and missed connections. There's a load of really good stuff available for free online. The Glamorgan Archives has got a very good website as well, where you can find material relating to Cardiff. And there's a sort of feminist newsletter that's mentioned in the book that is real, and you can see copies online, and it was produced on Moira Terrace and circulated in libraries and bookshops and stuff around Cardiff. So yeah, very research based. I think London is easier in a way in that there's so much already written about London, and there's a cultural idea of London that's quite strong, so you can sort of tap into that. And there's work by Lisa Powell and Ros Caverny about their time being sort of young and queer living in London and Scot culture that's been really helpful. The same to you really. Obviously you're writing about a longer period of time than me and a fascinating city. So how did you even start to approach such a wide span of time?
Yeah, probably in quite a chaotic way, I think, to begin with. I think one of the things I learned, because this is my first novel, is this time round I'm trying to be a lot more organised about how I organise my research notes, because I did end up researching the same things twice. I guess I was trying to it was helpful having a very particular location. So I spent quite a lot of time just hanging around in that neighbourhood and taking loads and loads of photos and finding any photos that I could from archives. And also looking at old films to get a sense of both Berlin but also that Friedrichstrasse in particular, because it's changed so much over the years. It used to be a really busy thoroughfare in 1906, which is when the first story is set, and now it's sort of truncated because it's a kind of dead end, and it's a street of huge contrast, because up at the sort of northern end around Unter den Linden, which is the big boulevard that goes up to the Brandenburg Gate. It's kind of like Bond Street. It's very expensive shops up there. But at my end of the street, it's much more workaday. There's sort of charity shops and kebab shops, and it's much more residential. So it's sort of quieter now. But I don't think it's always been like that. So trying to find out what it was like at different periods in time. I'm just reading lots first-hand accounts and fictional accounts. And just all those little details that you get about smells of the city, sort of those sensory details, those are really helpful. You know, the people who knew the Cold War talked about the very specific smells of East Berlin as opposed to West Berlin, because of course they're using different types of fuel or different types of disinfectant, and all those sort of little period details were helpful.
That's fascinating, and to think that that smell distinction is lost to time. I think we'll talk a little bit about sound later because I've got some specific questions, but I think that's really strong in the Berliners in terms of setting the scene of the city. So you've got the noise of the whatever mode of transport is most appropriate for that period of time, and whatever street sellers are selling at that point in time. That was really good to like root you in the place at a particular time. But sort of to go back almost before the research, what was the inspiration for the whole project?
I've always been fascinated since a child really with Berlin and with German history. I think it probably started with Judith Kerr's novel When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. Judith Kerr's probably most famous for The Tiger Who Came to Tea and her mob cat books. But she wrote a trilogy of books based on her own experience of being a German Jewish refugee in the 1930s. And I must have read those novels over and over and over again. So I think that was probably the beginning of it. And then I fell in love with cabaret music. I made a radio documentary years ago about Berlin cabaret and how, I mean, it really started with Liza Minnelli, let's be honest. But I became interested in the real music behind that, and the music that had inspired Kander and Ebb. And so made a radio documentary which took me to the city. It was a bit like when people go to New York, they say it feels familiar to them because they've seen it so many times in movies. I think I had the same experience of Berlin because I'd inhabited it so many times imaginatively. So it sort of felt strangely familiar to me as I walked around. And also
Friedrichstrasse, somewhere where that was particularly strong?
I think I just was interested in Friedrichstrasse, and I think when I was looking for a location for the book, I wanted somewhere that had kind of been on the front line of history, and it just offered that, I guess. But I think the experience of Berlin is such a haunted one. I mean, it's complex. It's not an entirely beautiful city in many ways, but I think we're so aware of all the history around you and the different kind of archaeological layers of that history. And you know, there's shrapnel scars in a lot of the stonework still. And also the Berliners are very good at marking their history. So there are plaques and there are photos telling you about the history of the city all over the place. And in fact, some of the stories in Berliners came out of some of those things I just found on my travels around Friedrichstrasse, because they're just little plaques everywhere. And stumble stones,
Yes.
which mark, they're literally in the pavement, bronze plaques marking where people were taken to concentration camps, usually, marking the home of Jewish people. So it's sort of the kind of the history and the marking of the history is really built into the city.
I agree. From my own travels to Berlin, I think they do that really well. Could we have a reading from the Berliners?
So this is from the 1906 section, which is told by a boy called Rudi, who's about 12. And he comes to Berlin, he's orphaned, and he ends up coming to Berlin because he's sort of taken in by his uncle, who runs the Academy for Magical Arts on Friedrichstrasse. And that was one of those things that was inspired by just wandering around Friedrichstrasse, because there was an Academy of Magical Arts. Mine bears no resemblance to whatever the real thing was. I just liked the idea, so I kind of ran with it. In Sachsenhausen, my father and Barbel, our living maid, had been my only company outside school. The academy, in contrast, seemed at first a place of endless noise and commotion, with the constant toings and froings, the production line of small boxes in and larger boxes out, the ferrying of props and drapes to party halls and theatres and cabarets. Friedrichstrasse itself was no less overwhelming. The carriages and automobiles that flared through its canyon of tall, elegant buildings, brandishing at every level brightly painted hoardings and advertisements, all the way up to the roof gutters. From Oranienburg in the north, crossing the Spree River and Unter den Linden, then a further mile south to the Peace Column in Marienplatz, the streets shimmered with people in motion, hawkers and newspaper boys dancing daringly around the hackney cabs and bicycles, shop girls trotting off to work in too tight shoes, office clerks and paper hangers, men with stained caps and drooping moustaches pushing handcarts, last night's drunks sobering up in doorways, salesmen scurrying to buses and trams, their cases of wares bashing against their legs. It was a place of endless movement, a continuous present. The Academy's home, number 19, was a handsome double-fronted Wilhelmine mansion at the southern end of Friedrichstrasse, built for some 19th century merchant who had overestimated either his own fortune or the construction costs, and fallen bankrupt shortly after the building's completion. It was 5 stories of golden and Silesian sandstone, with bay windows on the first 3 stories, ornamental stone balconies and elaborate relief work. Above the doorway's arch, crowned with a bas-relief of a woman's head, 2 words were carved into the stone: Cras tibi. Erholz had explained that they were an abbreviated form of a Latin motto: Hodie mihi, cras tibi. Today me, tomorrow you. A phrase more commonly found on tombstones. No one at the Academy seemed to know why the mansion's owner would have commissioned such a funereal inscription.
Thank you. Okay. I love the way that you create a sense of the city through the use of things like the names of the U-Bahn stations and the names of the streets. I think that's really effective. And also the way you mark the influence of the different global diaspora in Berlin, like the Turkish in particular is very strong. So you've talked a little bit already about Berlin as a place that's wrestling with the past. Is there anything else that you would like to add on that?
I suppose it's just my fascination with how Germany has processed its guilt, really, since the war. I mean, absurdly, I set out to write the novel and thought, I'm not going to write about the Third Reich. There are enough novels about that. So I deliberately didn't write about 1933 to 45. But of course, the whole novel ends up being pulled towards that period. And I suppose one of the themes that kind of emerged from it was that the different stages in which Germany has processed its own role in that period and its guilt, and how those different generations, and in fact the sort of split between East and West Germany and the different ways it happened in those countries as well.
Yeah, I think the way that you there's some sort of supernatural or magical realist elements, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but I love the way that that's set in the earlier part of the book in 1906, and it makes you think there's some characters that have a bit of a gift of foresight, and it makes you think that the horrors of the 20th century are almost like this sort of vortex sucking you in, and it can suck the past in as well. It is so powerful that even people that haven't been born yet can feel it.
Yeah, I think that I felt that about your novel as well. There's the sense that as William Faulkner said, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And was that something you were conscious of when you were writing? Because I think there's also something in the landscape of Neon Roses about the scars of the landscape, and the sense that they might be covered over now, and prettified possibly, but they're still there.
Yes, I definitely think that the 80s are alive and well. I mean, look at the response that Keir Starmer's had over this weekend when he's dared to praise Margaret Thatcher. I think it's really clear that the feeling is very, very strong. And I was very conscious about that when writing the novel. My father-in-law is a teacher in Astragunlice, and he is a teacher, not a minor, but he did a lot of fundraising as part of the teaching unions to show solidarity with the mining unions. And he said originally that he wouldn't read this book. I think he was drawn in by maybe the possibility of erotica in the end, if I know Pete. But he was saying that the 80s are still just too painful because of the poverty that he saw his students going through and his colleagues going through and the community that he was part of going through. So I was very aware of that, and I wanted to do it justice. And I mean, the Truth and Justice, what they call the All Grieve Truth and Justice Committee, they're a charity that are still fighting to protect people who are still suffering with the results of police brutality and the financial impact of the miners' strike even now. So I was very aware of that. And the landscape has been terribly scarred because I'm from Swansea originally, and I live in Cardiff. And the Neath Port Talbot area is somewhere maybe I just drive through on the M4, but my wife and I drove up there and spent quite a lot of time just like sitting on the side of the hill and drinking in the landscape and looking at the environment and the flora and the fauna. But I soon realised that some of the hills I was looking at weren't real hills, they're actually spoil tips that they've built over and planted new trees on. So I had to go back and look at some Natural Resources Wales maps of that area through time to see what was real and what was fake. And it's really great to see that there's this new industry of like sports going on up there. There's a lot of spoil tips that have been converted into runs for like off-road biking, and there's like horse places where you can go and ride horses. But there's still definitely the scars on the landscape, and people feel the scars as well in terms of like the air quality, and that is still affected. And that was something that stood out in your novel too, particularly in, I always mix up the timelines, typical. But when you talk about Berlin, and there's Ilse is the character in the 60s, and she talks about the difference between East Berlin and West Berlin, and how the Easterners haven't had as much of an opportunity to cover over those scars yet.
Yeah, there were still vast areas of East Berlin, and even in the late 60s it was still bomb sites. Whereas in West Berlin, mostly those had been covered over and gentrified.
I remember as a teenager going up to the top of the tower.
The TV tower. Yeah,
the TV tower, and my stepdad is an architect, and he was pointing out like how easily you can tell what's east and what's west just through the architecture and like what you described as holes left in it still.
Yeah, I think it's harder now. I think to see where east and west meet sometimes, because there's been so much redevelopment. The TV tower I like because it's just such a big kind of 2 fingers up to the west. It's like you'll see it from wherever you are in the city. Yeah. I think it's interesting as well that photography occurs in both books. Was that a sort of conscious kind of interest in the way we process images?
I think so. I really love the visual arts, and when I was younger I used to think that I could go to art college, and I'm particularly fond of lino printing and screen printing, which is what June's love interest is. I think that was just something I already know a bit about, so it was something I could write about with confidence. And Aline was always going to make her own clothes because she's creative and has opinions about clothes, but she's also plus size and living in the valleys and doesn't have very much money, so she can't really go out and buy something. She's got to be quite handy, and then if she's going to have a partner that matches her in temperament and interests, maybe that person's an artist too. So I think I was coming at it more on a character base, but why did you decide to talk so much about photography?
I think I got interested in early photography. It occurs in the 1906 section of the novel, and just became fascinated by the chemical process of how they went about making photos then. And it became a plot point in that there's a young girl who is apparently able to imprint visions on the future on these plates of silver nitrate. I'm no idea where that came from. Really. Just you were asking me earlier whether I sort of set out to write a magical realist novel, and I really didn't. I don't even believe in the supernatural, but I think it's probably just a symptom of that hauntedness of the city, that inevitably there are ghosts, and I guess that the different stories felt like they needed to sort of haunt each other. And I suppose I was interested also in time and our experience of time. And I suppose the kind of idea that all times exist at the same time. So the novel is sort of constructed in a way to reflect that slippage, really. There's a device where one chapter ends midway through a sentence, and then the next chapter starts midway through another sentence, but they sort of are intended to read.
Yeah, they definitely do. I sort of flip back and flip forward, and I like that. And how did you decide on that sort of formal device? Is it something you'd experimented with before?
No, and again, of course, it gave me real pain when I started moving chapters around, and I had to reconstruct my very, very tightly constructed sentences. But I suppose that was part of wanting to try to give that reader that experience of just suddenly moving into another time. You know, like opening the same door in the same apartment, and then you're in another era. I'm
not like a supernatural expert or anything, but I'm quite interested in the idea of time slips and the idea that people, there's apparently one in Liverpool where you see people from the 1960s walking down the street towards you, and stone tape theory, the idea that the buildings that we're in sort of record us and can play back echoes. And the section when Heike, who works in radio, is trying to record stuff, and she records echoes of what's gone on before. That gave me chills. I love that bit. Were you inspired by your own experience of working in the radio?
Yeah, I think there is something, because when you're out on location recording a radio programme and listening through the microphone onto your headphones, you're hearing spaces and rooms and buildings or landscapes in a really different way, I think, in a very alive kind of way. And I think you do have a sort of strange sense that you are maybe listening to voices that could be trapped within the walls. And, well, I don't know, that's a bit fanciful, possibly.
I love that story. I'm ready to let that in for the evening.
I was also interested in where you choose to end your novel, because it starts in the mine strike, but we end up with the Conservative election and section 28. Why did you want to end there in particular?
I think it was a sense that the struggle goes on. I mean, we know that from similar struggles that are going on today, that we're always sort of striving for equality and for social change, but it always is eluding us. And the idea that I didn't want to end it with sort of the miners' strike ends and that's sad, but maybe there's hope. I wanted to end it with like the next horrible thing almost, which makes it sound like a miserable book, and it's honestly not. The other place I was thinking of ending it was the idea of the lesbians abseiling into the Houses of Lords, which happened on the day that Section 28 was passed into law. But I just felt like that was a bit too on the nose and a bit too filmic. And I don't think Alina Dundrean would have gone to that event. But I've written a short story where there's a friend called Morgan, who's from Bala in Mid Wales, who is involved with the lesbian abseiling incident. I've written that as a short story, which I don't know what to do with, quite frankly. I might just put it on my website.
Yeah, I think it's really important to say that there's a lot of humour in it, and also a lot of sort of gorgeously, filthily erotic sex. Was that important to you to include that? Well, clearly it was.
Yeah, I think so. So growing up and reading Sarah Waters, I loved those scenes when I was younger, and reading things like Ruby Fruit Jungle, which has got some erotic scenes, and even Orlando, which is less like overtly erotic, but definitely like the ice skating scene was etched into my mind for years after. but I think lesbians or like bisexual women, queer women are often pushed into a sort of mumsy or like responsible role, and I loved It's a Sin, and I don't mean to criticise Russell T Davies, he went to my school, he's a hero of mine, but the lesbian characters in It's a Sin are sort of the responsible mumsy type. I just felt like it was time to have some fun, especially with the release of Rebel Dykes, which is a documentary film that looks back at archive footage from the late 80s and early 90s, which includes like a sort of sex club called Chain Reaction, which briefly features, only sort of in passing really, in Neon Roses. But that material is out there and it exists, and that history is out there and it exists, and it's important to talk about.
It's also, I guess, a counter to, you talk about the well of loneliness
Yeah,
in the novel.
I was really disappointed in the well of loneliness. I'm sorry if there's any fans in, but my mum bought me from the Cardiff Oxfam actually a like anthology of gay and lesbian writing that was published by an American university, and it must have come from a student here. And I remember reading it and just being a bit disappointed by the misery.
I think we should have another reading.
Oh, yes. So I'm going to read a section that's set in Cardiff Library, the central one in town that's now, whatever it is now. Oh, that's the wrong page. I'm so sorry. Yeah, well, I don't know what's happened to me. I've forgotten what to read. In the library, the only lesbian book she can think of to ask for is the one Julie Walters likes, An Educated Reader. She tucks her work lanyard into her bra before asking the librarian if they have Ruby Fruit Jungle. The librarian is off like a bloodhound. The cover of Ruby Fruit Jungle is subtle. Only a small pink flower gives an indication of its themes. The librarian lines up the date stamp under the previous one, stamping firmly on the paper slip. Who took it out? Did they read it for the same reasons as Alenid? The last time the book was taken out was in May. Whoever she was, she's still probably walking around Cardiff with the story fresh in her mind. Her sweaty fingers slip on the thick plastic cover as she carries it to Howell's, pushing it to the bottom of her bag. She'll start it when she's safely in her room. It's so hot that she can only stomach a cold tin of tuna for tea. She excuses herself to read Ruby Fruit Jungle, lying naked on top of her quilt, window directing a breeze at the back of her neck. She pores over coffee stains, dog ears, and the occasional thumbprint for clues about the previous lenders. The spine is deeply creased on the pages where Molly and Leota fuck. The thought of other women being turned on by the pages in her hand is a turn on in itself, like a hall of mirrors of women reading, dreaming, wanting. Alenid flicks the pages back and forth until the room darkens around her and she hears Mrs. Omar's knees squeaking on the polystyrene mat in the room next door for her last prayer of the day.
I suppose we should also say that both novels are kind of broadly interested in the countercultural.
Yes.
That was something that really struck me, actually, reading the two in conjunction.
Yeah, reading last night, I was reading the section where Tonya is meeting Monica for the first time, and there's a really similar dynamic between her and June, the idea of her as this like exotic stranger in leather and boots.
Yeah, so Tonya is from the 1980s section, and she ends up joining a group that's a bit like the Red Army faction, but isn't quite. And she ends up living like June in a squat, with all its kind of grimness of that lifestyle. But I think that's an important part of Berlin and Germany's history, actually.
Yeah, definitely what attracted me to it.
Yeah.
Is it?
And I suppose that there's also a bit of an intersection between queer lives and activist lives and artists' lives as well.
Certainly. I loved in your section about the cabaret, how it's still quite a dark place. It's not quite the sort of, I don't know, the sort that you might want to go to see cabaret on the West End for, and sort of love the depravity and the excess for one night. It's still quite a dark political place.
Yeah, I think it really was that in the 1930s. I mean, I think there was also the kind of slightly, tarted up, almost touristy version of it, with dancing girls and you know, pretty dresses. But I think the kind of the heart of Berlin cabaret in that era was political. What's interesting about it though is that it wasn't necessarily just leftist. And I think they tried. I think that was one part of it, but I get the impression from the research I've done that actually they tried to cater for lots of tastes. So maybe its satire wasn't always that effective because they were catering to a wide range of political points of view.
I thought it was good in that respect to hold up a mirror to people like myself who would like to holiday in the past. If I had the TARDIS, I would be just always nipping off to like play at being in Wolf Hall for the day and then be home in time for tea. And your depiction of the cabaret culture is very much not safe, and it's not somewhere you might want to go on holiday. And I think there's other sort of hints of protest against things like gentrification, and little hints of like even Bergheim is full of tourists these days, and people are making a hell of a lot of money building unaffordable flats. And I love that like political undercurrent to your text.
Yeah, I guess it's also that thing of playing tourist in these sort of spaces as well, and you know what's genuine, what's authentic, and what still exists that feels authentically political and activist.
And one thing I found really interesting about Tonya in particular is that she's a mother as well as a political activist, and there's lots of different types of motherhood in the novel. Why did you decide to write about that as a theme?
It's funny, a lot of people have pointed that out to me after I wrote it. It's one of those things that you don't realise you're doing when you're writing, and it's readers who say, oh, there's a lot about motherhood in here. Well, I am a mother, so I suppose that, that's one reason. But there are lots.
I did notice it the first time, and when I first read it, I wasn't a mother, and now I am. And I think that's why I was really, like, I found loads of passages about, particularly like having young children, very moving.
And there's quite a lot about the ambivalence of being a mother as well. It's not rosy by any means. I think that there are women who really struggle with. I mean, Tonya walks out on her young baby and leaves it, and then finds herself saddled with another baby that she wasn't expecting. So there's quite a lot of sort of renegotiations of different kinds of parental experience, I think.
And sort of people that have left home quite early and are searching for a bit of nurturing, and people that have difficult relationships with their parents who go back and ask their parents to account for what went on. And yeah, it's very interesting, that ambivalence and tension and conflict there.
And I also think in your novel with the sense of people washing up in London and finding each other, kind of that creation of a new sort of family. That feels like it's kind of an important theme.
Yeah, and there's a mother in the squat, and she's only mentioned very briefly, but one thing that I was kind of saddened to learn in my research that I hadn't really thought about before. Growing up, I was never really that interested in having kids, and I'd never really thought what might happen if you had kids and then figured out that you were gay, but it was quite often common to lose your children in a divorce, like we see in Carol or The Price of Salt as well. But there is a woman who has a baby who lives at the squat who doesn't feel like she can take the same political risks as some of the others, and her sort of outward gender presentation is much more like mainstream. And in my head, that was her way of protecting her right to be a parent, because you could lose custody for things like being, living in Green and Common, or being sort of unreliable in that sense.
Great. Should we throw it open to
Yeah.
the floor?
Would you like to do a second reading as well? Because we were going to, but I've gone off. I've gone off piste.
Shall I go? I might just go back a little bit to what we were saying about sound and sort of being inspired by my work in radio. So this is Heike is the kind of contemporary character, and she works in sound. She's a sound artist, and so she's just ordered herself a new digital recorder. There was a parcel waiting for her in her pigeonhole when she returned home, a new digital recorder. She carried it up to the apartment, and with a cup of lemon tea steaming on the table beside her, unpacked it carefully. The hit of freshly unwrapped plastic, scent of Leonie's Christmas toy excitement. She discarded the instructions without reading them, inserted batteries, mic, headphones. Her index finger hit record, and the acoustic world of the room dawned in her ears. The hot water pipes ticking, Frau Meyer's feet on the floor above, cupboards being opened, cooking pans. She adjusted the recording level. A vacuum cleaner from one of the apartments at the back of the building. A pigeon flapping somewhere. She couldn't quite place it. Perhaps it was sitting on the roof of the bay window or in the main stairwell. She picked out other sounds. A passing bicycle, a cafe awning being wound up across the street, a group of teenage boys swearing and laughing, tyres on the wet tarmac, branches moving in the wind. A single leaf from the tree outside fell against the window pane and lodged in a gap between wood and glass, fluttering. A car drove by with drum and bass turned up to full volume so that the whole building momentarily pulsed with it. Under all this was a sound she couldn't identify. She turned up the gain, her eyes squinting as though this would improve her hearing. Yes, there it was. A hum. A single sustained note, low as though on a cello or double bass. Heike wondered whether it was the purr of a distant machine, some kind of construction vehicle. But the pitch never wavered as she'd expected to. Just as she was about to turn the machine off, her experiment complete, a voice spoke directly into her ear. What else can we do? Heike instinctively turned around to see the elderly man who had spoken, but the room was empty. She called out, "Hello?" and then immediately felt foolish. Someone must have been speaking loudly on the landing outside or accidentally turned their TV on with the volume full. Whoever had spoken had gone quiet, moved off. But then distantly, a woman weeping. Frau Meyer? But the sound seemed to be outside the door, not above. Still recording, but slipping her headphones down to her neck, Heike went to the door of the apartment and opened it. She stood on the landing, listening. But the only human sound was that of the vacuum cleaner being passed back and forth. She put her headphones back over her ears, but the crying had disappeared. Heike breathed in deeply in an effort to wake up, to uncloud her senses. Everything in front of her felt oddly remote. She pressed the stop button a little too hard and walked back into the apartment. Sitting on the sofa, she listened back to the track she'd just recorded. There it all was. Pipes, floorboards, cupboards, pans, vacuum cleaner, bike, awning, leaf, drum and bass. She heard herself stand up and open the apartment door, heard her feet slip-slap out onto the landing. But this time there was no cello note, no male voice, no weeping. She pulled the headphones from her ears, threw the machine down on the cushion beside her. She was clearly going mad. This was where late nights and red wine and flirting with undertakers got you. Thank you very much. Any questions?
I've got a question. So, first of all, thank you for a wonderful conversation. It's very fascinating, and it's good to hear your processes and the themes which were evoked in your novels. First, a comment or an observation. I did like how you mentioned how the idea of motherhood is like this kind of unintentional or unconscious kind of theme which emerged in the writing. And I'm just wondering for Rachel, is there any kind of similar thing which happened when you were writing your book? Was any kind of unintentional or unconscious kind of themes or motif which emerged when you kind of read it back and you go, oh gosh, this is I didn't intend this.
One thing that my agent pointed out is how much Alina thinks about her grandma, and I think my grandma was a very big figure in my early life and then died when I was 10, but she was very, very bright and moved from Almanford to London and then back to Swansea. And she was just amazing and had the most brilliant stories. It was so bright and actually quite sharp, not always the nicest, cutesy grandma. And she was very lefty and very radical, and she travelled a lot. She went to Moscow on the bus and she went to Siberia on the bus. And I think that unconsciously, Alina talks a lot about what her grandmother would think of this or that outfit or spending time with her grandmother, and that definitely came out unconsciously.
Rachel, in your acknowledgements in the back of the book, you discuss talking about the 80s with your mother, and I found that very interesting. I wonder what those conversations were like, because I feel a lot of history for us is sort of passed down through generations.
So often I would just like call her with something whilst I was writing and say, like, oh Mum, what was like the most common sandwich filling if you were skint? And she'd say like a chicken paste or something like that. Or I'd say like, what was the most popular flavour of crisp? Or how much did those crisps cost? And then we had more like intimate conversations, and I would say like, what was your best like pull-in move, which she said she would go out wearing suspenders, dance up to someone, get them to like, well, him, to put his hand up her thigh so he could feel the suspenders, and then like gauge his reaction. So that definitely made it into the book. But we would talk about like relationships and love, and it was a really good opportunity to talk about those things. My mum's a psychiatric nurse, and she had a fling with a married policeman. I don't know why I added the word married. Jesus Christ, she's going to watch this on YouTube, kill me. With a policeman during the 80s, and my grandmother told her to break it off, and every time my grandmother would drive through past the police station, she'd like oink and say, oh, there's the piggery, and she used to say similar things about my mum's sort of partner during the 80s. So yeah, I really got a lot from those conversations. I also had great conversations with Lisa Power, who lives in Cardiff now, but was living in London in the 80s. And she was one of the first volunteers at Switchboard. She was the first lesbian woman to speak at the UN. And to like go for tea with her and just ask her loads of questions was incredible. And she told me about how her and her friends used to buy dildos from like a catalogue in America, and then like ship them over to the UK and pass them off as like not dildos, and they were like weird shapes to try and get them past the customs officials. And she really helped me with when I said that Alina works in a shop, she was quite surprised, and she was like, oh, she must be a very feminine lesbian to get away with like working on the makeup counter, because those are very hyper femme spaces. And I said, yeah, Alina, it is quite femme. And she said, oh, that would be really good to have like a woman on the inside. And I said, what do you mean? And she said that when she volunteered at Switchboard, there was a civil servant who worked at I don't know, one of the posh offices in Westminster somewhere, who used to print a lot of their leaflets for them free of charge. And she said that perhaps for like trans women, being able to access like free or cheap makeup from someone that worked in a makeup counter without a judgment, where they could just be given like a bag of samples that no one really wants, would be a really useful thing. So I developed that into a bit of a subplot. And yeah, talking to like queer elders was definitely one of the best things about writing. My auntie's gay as well, and well, she didn't realise until she was in her 40s or 30s, but her partner was involved with like Green and Common and that sort of era of activism. She lived in Manchester. They were like three really good sources of information. Did you do much like chatting to Berliners?
Yeah, that was really important actually, especially the sort of the way the city had changed in recent decades and post-reunification. I think that was really helpful.
How did you find them?
Just friends, and then friends of friends, and then the word gets out when you're writing. So yeah, it was sort of friends of friends really. Or again, it's just those details that you need to know. You just need somebody you can phone saying, yeah, how would you do this? Where would you buy this?
In the 80s, they're thinking sort of, how would you get from somewhere to somewhere else without a map? For my mum, how did you know when to like meet up with someone? Did you have to just set a date in advance and believe in it? Have you had any feedback from the Berliners that you interviewed about the book?
Yeah, they've been very supportive actually, and I think a real highlight for me was going back to, there's a fantastic bookshop on Friedrichstrasse called Dussman's, which features in the novel, and going in there, and the novel was on display there with a bookseller there had written a little report of it, and I was like, that really meant a lot.
That's epic. I had a similar moment in Gaze the Word, which features in the book because it was around, and there's been some really interesting interviews online with the original owners of Gaze the Word, the bookshop in London, which I used, and they were so welcoming and let me come in and sign the books and took pictures of me outside. It's just really a good
It's like it's come
moment.
home.
Yeah.
I was wondering if both of you could talk about how you write about families who might be split by politics, and how sort of something as serious as politics can sometimes be changed by family relationships. Is that a feature?
Well, it certainly is in Neon Roses, isn't it?
Yeah, so there's Mably, who's the more sort of Thatcherite sister, and because I've never been brought up that way, I found it quite hard to not make her a sort of cartoon Tory. And I think there's lots of like cartoon Tories in fiction and on telly. So I actually rewrote some chapters from her point of view, where Enid was the unreasonable one, and sort of evidenced that. And that was helpful to try and flesh out that depiction. And towards the end, they do reunite a bit. And my editor wanted to make Mably more and more of a feature of the book and have it almost like a tale of two sisters. And I made a diagram, because I'm quite a visual thinker, of like all the, and sort of colour coded all the chapters that Mably is mentioned, and is it in a positive or negative sense, and does she turn up, or is she just mentioned, to try and flesh out that relationship between the sisters. But I find it quite hard because I'm estranged from two of my sisters. Yeah.
There's not so much in the families, I suppose, in the Belliners, but I suppose I wanted to look at some of the nuances and complexities, especially the politics in the squat, where, you know, ostensibly they're all kind of singing from the same hymn sheet politically, but then of course there's they're supposed to, it's all about supposed to be an egalitarian society, but of course there are lots of little hierarchies and bullyings and people being exploited and gender politics coming into play, and so it's just trying to find. I think I was just trying to find those different characters within that sort of strange family, and what role they play, and the kind of different shades of their politics, I suppose.
Yeah, the ambiguity and the complexity and hypocrisy is so realistic to those sorts of spaces.
Yes, an archivy question, I guess. Both of you seem to, I've read your numbers and I look forward to reading your book as well. You both seem to engage with archive and with public history in a way that's really like A-star 100 archive points. It's really sensory and creative, as well as being, you know, concerned with the truth of the situation as it was at the time. But going through an archive is not a particularly sensory, sexy thing. And I wonder what could an archive like us do to make this kind of engagement easier for you, or to make it more sensory. Is there anything that archives could do to support this kind of more of this kind of work?
I think I've only had good experiences, really. When I approached the People's History Museum, I was quite self-conscious about not being, like, at that point I had no agent, no book deal, I don't have even like an MA or a PhD or anything, so I was just a woman with a pen. But they made it very clear that I didn't need any of those things, and they couldn't have been more welcoming, and they explained to me exactly what to do, so I wasn't worrying like, oh, do I use a pen, do I use a pencil, am I allowed to take photographs? They had a very clear one side of A4 with like all the do's and don'ts, and they made sure that they came over and chatted to me and asked me if I'd seen everything I wanted to see. And similarly, the Bishopsgate in London is lovely. There's an archivist there called Steph who gave me a personal tour of the archive and all of his highlights of the archive. And even, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but there was like a pile of stuff that was going to go in the skip, I think, because it was like, well, maybe not the skip, but the charity shop or something. And it was like duplicate novels that they'd been gifted. And he was like, oh, is there anything in there that would be useful that you could take home? And yeah, that was wonderful.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, really. I think it is those personal, it's always the staff, and it's those personal connections and those conversations that lead you from one thing to another.
Yeah.
How do you find when writing the Belliners, like grappling with all that research of different eras? Because I imagine it's hard writing about any era that you didn't live through, but writing about a number of different eras, that must be so difficult. How did you manage that?
I suppose I didn't find it difficult because I was fairly obsessive, but what I wasn't very good at, as I was saying at the beginning, was being meticulous about keeping the notes. So I did end up, when we were sort of copy edit stage, going back and having to kind of double check things. I was like, I know I made a note on that somewhere, and then having to sort of almost start from scratch. I ended up spending a vast amount on books and resources as well. So my shelves at home are full of books on Berlin. But what's great is there's so much material, and I think that the difficult thing is kind of not getting distracted, because you inevitably come across, oh, that's great. Can I wedge that in somehow? And I think it's knowing what's useful and what is just an extra bit of flim-flam, or might be just interesting to you in that moment, but isn't really serving your characters or the plot.
You said that you did not want to write about the Third Reich. Do you think it would be possible to write a novel about Berlin without it, or what would it look like?
Yeah, I don't know that it is actually. I think I found that the proof is here that it was impossible not to write about it in the end, because even the pre-Third Reich sections end up sort of pointing towards it, because it's impossible to write without our hindsight, and even because I read, as well as historical accounts, I was reading first-person accounts from different eras, and even there you can see it in the late 20s. You can see what's coming.
I actually thought that you touched upon that in your last reading, where it's very, very evocative, the sound recording episode, and it made me think of surveillance and the Cold War, and whether that was something that you intended in that section.
Yes, and I think again it's one of those things I didn't really realise until afterwards, was all the images of photography and lenses and I guess recording as well. But that's there in every section actually.
Any other questions? Colin?
So I'm curious to know what kind of bits did you have to cut out? Because it seems like there's many of what I'm getting is it's about character really, and people go to places and they meet people and they experience things. So how do you know when you've got a bit that isn't working? What kind of bits were they?
I think for me, towards the end, I got a bit sort of almost soap opera or episodic with it, because I really like writing about the queer domestic, and I don't feel like there's enough of that. So it was very much, Elided and June go on a date to the museum, Elided and June meet each other's parents, like I was writing a sitcom. And my editor helped me work out which of those were important and which of those could merge into each other. And then at the beginning, almost the opposite, it was sort of dry, like the preamble of was the miners' strike a good idea? Did Arthur Scargill make the right decisions? Was it legitimate at all? Was it always obvious from the start that it was going to fail? And sort of conversations with Elided and her dad, where she'd be like, tell me about your feelings about Arthur Scargill, Dad. So paring those down into something that people would actually say to their families.
Yeah, I think the things I cut were very kind of on the nose appraisals of German history, I think. Also, when I know it's amazing, I forget where I started, or I forget what the stories look like in their initial stages. But I think initially I started out with 6 separate stories, and I don't think they really talked to each other much, but then I realised more and more how they could talk to each other, and then you start to think, oh, I could do that, or I could plant that, and then to start to have fun with the kind of seeding little clues, and becoming aware of what the reader experience is going to be, so that you think, oh, that would be fun if I just plant that there, and people might not notice, but if they do notice, and there'll be a little kind of little hit of pleasure when they've made that connection, just sort of leaving little surprises.
It's Did you ever draw a floor plan of the apartment?
Oh yeah, and then I redesigned it at one point. Don't like it, it's not working, so I had to redesign it.
I think one of my favourite reoccurring little Easter eggs was the mirror, the dragon mirror.
Yes, there are certain objects that survive different periods and occur in different stories. So yeah, again, those are sort of little plants, I suppose.
I think it's interesting as well how, thinking about the city, how few scenes seem to take place in sort of recognisably sort of tourist places. If you were writing about London, they don't go to Trafalgar Square. They go to the Electric Ballroom. It's about as touristy as the trip to London gets. I suppose, I don't know what my question was when I started talking. How much of it is about trying to paint a picture of what it's like inside a room in someone's house, in someone's domestic lives? How do you?
Yeah, because I think the squat in Camden, is it in Camden, is really redolent. I can really smell it.
It felt very true.
Yeah.
Spending time in those places, not necessarily squats. Well, I did hang out at Squat a bit as an undergrad, the red and black umbrella by the Clifton Street. But yeah, just like friends' houses and how you feel really comfortable in each other's houses to just take your shoes off and like start making something in the kitchen, and your houses all just become one. So that was my imagination. I think all of the houses are places that I've been, houses that I've lived in. Alina done her family home is probably my grand's house, and their apartment when Alina moves out is probably like the first flat that I lived in after uni. But I also sketched out like where the furniture is and stuff to help me imagine.
I mean, my apartment is entirely imaginary, but I did spend a lot of time walking through it imaginatively and wondering where the furniture was and wondering how you'd have to negotiate the space and what it would look like in different areas, and was a wall knocked down at a certain point. What would be the view out the window?
And how the light might come in, the characters talk about that.
Yes, because that becomes important to the photographers about the direction of the light in their studio in the 1900s. So it's all those sort of things. And trying to imagine what you'd hear, as you were saying, out the window, or what you'd see out the window at a certain point in history.
Any questions?
Can I ask about language? Like phrases. Obviously, they would be German, wouldn't they? Wouldn't be English. I imagine you're a German speaker, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm a very bad German speaker, this hope. And there are some German phrases in it.
Yes.
I mean, of course, you're sort of writing in translation, as it were, because it's in English, but inevitably, just the language for kind of detail and colour, and I mean, I love the sound of German, so it's there for that reason. And sort of song lyrics as well, I think.
Thank you.
There's a question at the back.
I'm fascinated by your apartment, and I'm so sorry I haven't read your book yet, but the way you talk about it as this constant and all times at once, I was wondering how much it might be a character in and of itself, or whether it's more just a formal device that enables you to write what you need to for the characters and the different time periods.
I think it probably did become a character for me. I don't know if it does for the reader. I find that hard to judge, but...
Because it sort of sounded like that as you talked, you seemed to really care.
Yes, I think, and I do feel like if I've lived there, I could probably dream it. And in fact, I went to stay, I realised that the building that I'd sort of modelled it on, that there was an Airbnb apartment. So I went, and this was after I'd written the first draft of the novel, And then I went and stayed in it, and
Oh, wow.
that was sort of weird because I was like, oh, I'm sort of in the house. And it felt really familiar. So that was
Amazing.
Okay. Thank you very much for this, and a big hand please for Emma and Rachel.